This is the man who invented baseball sims. He was a failure. Clifford Van Beek, who we'll call Cliff, was born February 27, 1903. Rumor has it that he was in an orphanage for the first 5 years of his life, though I haven't found any evidence of this. He's listed as having parents in the 1930 U.S. Census. Cliff grew up with his family in Green Bay, Wisconsin. His grandfather was J. L. Van Beek, who was a well-known grocer in the Green Bay area. Cliff went into the family business and was a grocer, but Cliff's heart was in sports. Now, at some point in time, Cliff created a dice baseball game. He must have been a teenager when he put it together because he applied for a patent for this game when he was only 20. Cliff's approach to baseball on Tabletop was revolutionary. But to understand this, we'll have to go back in time a little bit. Dice baseball goes back to the early 1880s at least. There is a mention of some kind of parlor dice baseball game in an 1866 magazine from New York. The earliest dice baseball games that we know about were really simple. You would roll a single die. The number would give the outcome with 6 possible outcomes. By the late 1880s, there were some variations allowing for 2 die, and sometimes it would come up to as many as 3 different dice. With each of these games, however, you had to imagine your own team. There were no player cards, there were no teams that came with the game. There were only the dice and maybe a board. Now, the dice in these games are different than the dice that I have here, right? They were all the same color, and they were the same size, and the numbers were combined together, not added, going from the smallest number rolled and working to the largest. Now, the most famous of these early dice baseball games was called Steele's Inside Baseball. It was made by a professional advertiser who had a lot of experience in the early automotive industry. Steele's game was patented. He released it around 1913, sold it for $1. But it didn't include any player cards. It was just a board, 3 dice, and some accessories. If you wanted to play it yourself, you had to imagine your own team. Steele's game was mostly known for the huge advertising campaign around it. There were other games that used 3 dice at that time, all of which were more or less based on Steele's formula. Now, Clifford Van Beek changed all of this. He applied for a patent for his game in September 1923. That patent was then granted in May 1925. Van Beek's game was different than Steele's game. It used 2 dice and a board. If you look at the board, you can see that it looks a lot like Steele's board. It's pretty clear that Clifford Van Beek was influenced by that. Now, these dice were still combined like with those older games, but with 2 dice of different size, more rolls were possible. Van Beek originally designed the game so that it would be 2 dice of different colors, but as he marketed it, ended up being 1 big die and 1 small die. 1 die was always read first with this system, and the other die was always read second. But the real innovation was Cliff's cards. So Cliff came up with a card matrixing system, something that to my knowledge had never been done before in baseball games or in any sports game that I could find. This is easier to show than it is to explain. You roll 2 dice. You look at the player's card and get a number based on that dice roll. Remember, one dice is read first, the next one read second. You then look that number up on the board. So it's pretty simple, but it's really effective. This allowed different cards to be made for different players. Hitters who had different batting averages in real life would now perform differently in-game. Van Beek's method really was brilliant, and so he decided to market it. Sometime in 1930, he contracted with a local printer in Green Bay to create high-quality copies of his game. Cliff went through steps to establish himself as a tabletop game creator, creating his own company, the Major Games Company. And it failed. It failed horribly. National Pastime was released in December 1930. It was advertised in a small ad on the back page of the December 11th, 1930 issue of the Sporting News. The ad is really easy to miss. Now, rumor has it that another ad came out in Baseball Magazine, though I've never seen any photo or evidence of that claim. There were certainly no advertisements in the local Green Bay newspaper. Now, in 1932, there were 2 mentions of Cliff's company, the Major Games Company, in those local Green Bay newspapers, but they weren't good. Those mentions detail a lawsuit between Cliff and his printer. So it turns out that Cliff had agreed to pay $650 for 1,000 copies of his game. He had allegedly only paid $450 by 1932, for which he received the first 500 copies, but he'd never paid the remaining balance. It's not clear if the remaining 500 copies were ever printed, but what is clear is that the Major Games Company went out of business as a result of this lawsuit, which Cliff lost. Now, I've heard that there's a customer list that exists. I've never seen it. I strongly suspect, however, that Cliff's sales were really poor. As a result, the original National Pastime game is extremely rare. Now, I should note here, I'm talking about the 1930 original game. There were other games, at least 2 others in the 1940s with the same name, but they're completely different games. We're talking about the original National Pastime game with the 2 dice and with the matrix cards. I've only heard of 2 versions of National Pastime selling on the open market over the last 25 years. It's extremely rare and scarce. Even reprinted versions are hard to find. Though the game allegedly saw 1,000 printed copies, depending on which story you believe, it seems to be scarcer today than the cloth version of Monopoly. And all in all, the project was a complete failure. But then something happened. A young man named J. Richard Seitz in Lancaster, Pennsylvania was a fan of this game. He was frustrated when his mail to the Major Games Company was returned undelivered, and so he started making his own cards. And soon Seitz's project turned into APA Baseball. The game, first published in 1951, that laid the framework for all current baseball sims and basically created the market. Seitz profited greatly. Cliff, on the other hand, is only a footnote in history. Now, Van Beek is recognized only by a few people, mostly geeks like me. He did receive some recognition in the local newspaper before he passed away. He was recognized in 1979, in fact, with a front page article. But the article is about what a great Green Bay Packers fan he was. The only mainstream news article about National Pastime that I could find came in 1984, which is 2 years after he passed away. Now, I think it's high time that Cliff received his due.